Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Humanities Center. One of the things I want to say before I get going is one of the things that's really, really nice about this series is seeing some familiar faces returning to campus. It's lovely to see Florence here, and John, lovely to have you here. And we have Marianne and Michael Fow, who are with us. It's always lovely to see you both. And while Marianne is here, I want to alert you all to one of the great treasured events of the USD year, which is the Angelus Sacred Music Concert, which is taking place this Saturday on March the 1st in Founders Chapel with some wonderful pieces by Bach. Free admission, and that's a real joy. So please come to 7 o'clock on Saturday, March the 1st. So again, lovely to have you with us. And it's lovely to have you all with us for this third session in our semester-long series on the city. And last week's session focused on the art of the city, and today our attention turns to literary treatments of the city. To offer their reflections on this inspiring topic, I'm delighted to welcome to the Humanities Center 3 splendid faculty members from USD's College of Arts and Sciences. Ryan Abrecht gained his PhD from UC Santa Barbara and is associate professor in the Department of History. He is a specialist in ancient Mediterranean history and culture with a particular emphasis on the history of the Roman Empire. He has written on climate change, violence, and migration in late antiquity, and is a contributor to the Oxford Encyclopedia of Ancient Greece and Rome. Dr. Abrecht is a great friend of the Humanities Center and has offered some of our most fascinating and, I must say, brilliantly titled seminar classes for students, including Atoms, Pleasure, and Death, How to Get Yourself Killed in Antiquity, and currently, Old Men Yelling at Clouds. Deniz Perin-Coombs received 2 bachelor's degrees in English and French from the University of Washington and an MFA in creative writing from San Diego State University. She is an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of English, where she's taught since 2007. She has also worked at the International Rescue Committee, where she taught vocational ESL to newly arrived refugees and citizenship courses to refugees preparing for their naturalization tests. Professor Perin-Coombs has published poetry and prose in various literary journals, including Atlanta Review, Pacific Review, and Sentence. She has also been lauded for her translations of Turkish poetry. Fred Miller-Robinson received his PhD from the University of Washington and is now Emeritus Professor of English, having been a member of faculty here at USD for 34 years, from 1991 to 2021 before his retirement. He has also been interim chair of the drama and music departments and received the Davis Award for Teaching Excellence in 2002 and the Drinan Award for Service in 2016. Among his many publications are the books Rooms in Dramatic Realism, published by Routledge in 2015, The Man in the Bowler Hat, His History and Iconography, and 2 really brilliant books on comic theory, The Comedy of Language and Comic Moments, books I love, actually. So, speaking with us today about the literary city, please welcome Professors Abrecht, Perin-Coombs, and Robinson.
Thank you, Professors Abrecht and Robinson, for letting me come up first today. I'll be doing a little survey. Oops. Are you saying I'm short? No, I'm just kidding. I'll be doing a little survey of poets and their cities. So I'm going to start with 2 modern and then go on to 2 contemporary poets and talk about their respective cities. The first poet I'm going to be talking about is Gwendolyn Brooks and her wonderful city of Chicago, specifically Southside Chicago, which became known as Bronzeville. Gwendolyn Brooks was devoted to her community of Bronzeville and so much so that she remains a cherished member and icon of Bronzeville. And as you can see in the, I don't know how to point, but in the panel to the left of the screen, she was depicted in this Renaissance mural in Bronzeville alongside notable figures such as Harold Washington, who was the first African American to be elected Chicago's mayor in 1983. And the mural, much like Brooks's poems, also includes depictions of the neighborhood's youth that represent the future of Bronzeville. In fact, Brooks' first collection, published in 1945, was called The Street in Bronzeville. Her goal in this collection was to paint pictures of regular, everyday people living in the neighborhood, which is depicted more or less in that map as well. Among the first poems in the collection is a poem titled Of DeWitt Williams on His Way to Lincoln Cemetery. This poem describes DeWitt Williams, who was, as she calls him, a plain black boy who died very young, and she describes his coffin moving through the city. And this video has part of the poem in her voice, so I wanted to play that for you.
Drive him past the pool hall, drive him past the show, blind within his casket, but maybe he will know. Down through 47th Street, underneath the L, and Northwest Corner Prairie that he loved so well. Don't forget the dance halls, Warwick and Savoy, where he picked his women, where he drank his liquid joy. Born in Alabama, bred in Illinois, he was nothing but a plain black boy. Swing low, sweet, sweet chariot, nothing but a plain black boy. Drive.
So on one hand, the poem calls attention to the city's history. The lines highlighted in blue, born in Alabama, bred in Illinois, calls attention to the Great Migration, when, of course, blacks and people of color were moving north, away from the South, and many of them were moving to Chicago. And in the highlights in yellow, you can see reference to specific places like the pool hall, the show, 47th Street, the L subway, etc. And what's interesting is that you kind of see the city as a character in the poem, but from the point of view, quote unquote, of this young boy's coffin as it's moving through the streets of Chicago. That being said, Gwendolyn Brooks did not stop at describing the city as seen from the outside. She would also zoom into different scenarios. So we see people in their homes, in taverns, and in pool halls. And who, of course, can forget her iconic and very well-known poem, We Real Cool.
The pool players, 7 at the Golden Shovel. We real cool, we let's go, we light, we strike straight, we sing, we din gin, we jazz June, we jazz spoon.
While the poem is about this group of young men, city life is actually permeating the poem's pores. Here, the poet pauses to reflect on the lives taking place within the city. In her memoir, Brooks wrote, quote, "The boys have no accented sense of themselves, yet they are aware of a semi-defined personal importance, say the we softly." Later she added, "Today, many such boys, their girlfriends too, expect to die soon. In Chicago, in New York, in Springfield, in Philadelphia, in Guadalajara, Alabama, in Detroit, they do not expect to become 21. They are designing their funerals." So here the city becomes representative of the nation, and the nation becomes representative of the city. Around the same time, the New York School of Poets was taking off. It included poets such as John Ashbery, Barbara Guest, Kenneth Koch, and Frank O'Hara, who's in the front of the picture there, smoking his cigarette. These poets celebrated the strangeness of urban life, and an urban sensibility was incorporated into much of their work. In the Oxford Book of American Poetry, David Lehman refers to O'Hara as, quote, the charismatic hero, the catalyst, the guy who made it all make sense. The divey downtown bars and the midtown galleries, the cocktail parties and tuxedos, the afternoon tabloids with a social conscience. O'Hara famously made the city itself a consistent theme in his work. In fact, he was so attached to the variety and the hectic pace of New York City life that he once claimed, quote, I can't even enjoy a blade of grass unless I know there's a subway handy, or a record store, or some other sign that people do not totally regret life. One of his best-known poems is called A Step Away from Them. And in this poem, actually, I'm going to go back for a second. This poem was one of the lunch poems. And in that collection, basically, almost all of his poems, if not all of them, were written during his lunch breaks where he worked at the MoMA in Manhattan. And he would kind of take walks and jot down some lines and then stuff them in a drawer and forget all about them. And the MoMA actually has a page dedicated to Frank O'Hara in which he says that these poems lyrically document his sensory love affair with New York City. And one of the most famous poems, like I said, is A Step Away from Them. It opens with these lines. It's my lunch hour, so I go for a walk among the hum-colored cabs. First, down the sidewalk where laborers feed their dirty, glistening torsos sandwiches and Coca-Cola with yellow helmets on. They protect them from falling bricks, I guess. Then onto the avenue where skirts are flipping above heels and blow up over grates. The sun is hot, but the cabs stir up the air. I look at bargains and wristwatches. There are cats playing in sawdust. On to Times Square where the sign blows smoke over my head. So in these opening lines, on one hand, you can see many scenes from New York City, right? And this was written in the 50s as well. So we have these iconic things like, Coca-Cola, the skirts flipping above heels, which if you think back to, the Marilyn Monroe iconic scene, and of course, New York's famous cabs. At the same time, the poet is placing himself in the scenes of the city, right? I comes up for many times. I go for a walk. I look at bargains and wristwatches, so he's actually part of the scene. He's not separate from it. A few lines later, we have an explosion of sound with these lines. Everything suddenly honks. It is 12:40 of a Thursday. A few lines later, I stop for a cheeseburger at Juliet's Corner. Giulietta Massina, wife of Federico Fellini e Bellatrice. Sorry, Antonio, for my accent. And chocolate malted. A lady in foxes on such a day puts her poodle in a cab. So again, we have these iconic scenes. One thing he was really known for doing was putting specific places in capital letters, like Juliet's Corner. But he would kind of let himself go on these stream of consciousness. He would think about Federico Fellini's wife for a second, and then go back to, getting his cheeseburger and chocolate malted. Again, very famous items for the 50s. And here come the cabs again, right, with this woman putting her poodle in there. He gets a little more wistful here when he says, and one has eaten and one walks, past the magazines with nudes and the posters for bullfight and the Manhattan storage warehouse, which they'll soon tear down. And the poem ends with the lines, a glass of papaya juice and back to work. My heart is in my pocket. It is poems by Pierre Verdi. So here, once more, in those last couple lines, he's asserting himself as part and parcel of the scene. He's getting his glass of papaya juice and he's going back to work. He, too, is contributing to New York City life. He's not just observing it, he's part of it. I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the present day and two contemporary poets. The first is Deniz Smith, and you can see their Instagram bio right there. Deniz Smith is a contemporary poet living in Minneapolis. And no, I didn't just choose them because they have a name that sounds similar to mine. Maybe that was an added perk, but Their latest collection, Bluff, is a collection that contends with the hard questions of the state of our nation, their home city of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and their role as an artist, poet, and human in all of it. According to their publisher, Grey Wolf Press, the collection was, quote, written after 2 years of artistic silence, during which the world came to a halt due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and Minneapolis became the epicenter of protest following the murder of George Floyd. Bluff is Deniz Smith's powerful reckoning with their role and responsibility as a poet and with their hometown of the Twin Cities, end quote. In the poems in Bluff, the poet makes us fall in and out of love with the Twin Cities. And more than that, we fall in and out of love with humanity. They paint portraits of a city in deep anguish following George Floyd's murder. But in the searing beauty of the poem's language, they give us hope that humanity is still out there somehow, somewhere. I-35 West North Downtown Exits is an ode to the city that birthed the poet and killed them at the same time. The poem opens with the lines, Minneapolis, my murderer, my mothership, my moose heart, my mercy will end in you. Nearing your southern face, you almost look safe. So beautiful you could stare too long and miss the ice winter, the most innocent killer here. I remember you purple blazed when Prince passed, the sky plum-stained, bridges bruised violet, so gorgeous, you liar. You didn't miss him. You wanted money for his missing. And the poem ends with an image of those who have caused the city's residents so much pain. Where the people raged, you build a business. I don't trust your purple lights, blue on red on blue on red. I don't trust your purple. The cops could be anywhere. Ultimately, the poem begs the questions, can and should we love the city that hurts us? Can and should we love the city we can't trust? Can and should we help it? Deniz Smith originally wrote Minneapolis, St. Paul as an essay that was published in The New Yorker in June 2020. It was just checking on time. It was then titled Crying, Laughing, Crying at the George Floyd Protests in Minneapolis. It's since changed titles and made its way into Bluff as a poem essay. Here are some excerpts which I believe speak for themselves. And it opens with this. It happened again. This time, they did it with a knee. Cause of death? $20 and the police. For George Floyd, the crowd stretches down Chicago Avenue, cutting the city through the 3rd Precinct, just how the construction of I-94 once ripped through the black neighborhood of Rondo in St. Paul without question or apology. On Hiawatha, a few blocks from the now-destroyed precinct, there's a daycare playground full of little black kids. Sun-blessed, little fades and puffs and hijabs, little hands gripping the fence, little feet jumping, jumping, little mouths a chaos of smile and chant. Black lives matter. Black lives matter. They say it with their teeth and whole bodies. A little bit later in the poem. When I go to Midway to clean up with my mama and my broom, I'm sad to see the Foot Locker in Midway is gone, but only for the memories of matching tall trees with the homies. Sorry, tall tees with the homies. The parties we dressed ourselves for, only to be stopped by cops for wearing the same color. Foot Locker will be fine. I'm pissed at whoever busted the windows out of Best Steakhouse, but I forgive them. I'm worried about who is going to get to rebuild the now burnt and burning Twin Cities, if neighborhoods in St. Paul and Minneapolis will be further gentrified by flame. Bad Phoenix. How do you kill the unkillable thing, the thing that builds the most dangerous and violent houses? The precincts, the banks, the courts, the boardrooms, the leasing office, the Capitol. One thing that struck me about those last lines was the contrast that Deniz is making between what they call the unkillable thing, things like the leasing office in the capital, with the humans living in a city who are all too killable. Another poem essay they wrote, called My Beautiful End of the World, is also in Bluff. And despite all of the pain that Minneapolis has caused the poet, Minneapolis is still home. In this essay, Deniz ponders the paradox between the city's parks, its nature, and its redlining, between gentrification and poverty. Smith begins by admiring the city's parks, as we can see in the second section of the essay. There's a statistic I kind of know about how something like no one in Minneapolis lives more than 10 blocks from a park. True or not, it's a rumor, I believe, for how lush it blooms in my mind and my peace. The trees sashay in the wind, leaves turned into thin tambourines. The essay, though, radiates out of two central questions as it continues. I'm thinking about the formerly red-line neighborhoods all over the U.S. that are often treeless, locked out of green, hotter, and more vulnerable to climate change than the other side of town they were othered from. Who does this country believe deserves beauty? Who is allowed nature? And that's the question, or those are the questions. After some contemplation as the essay continues, this is what they decide. I must amend my looking. I must tell the truth of Minneapolis and the trees. And that's exactly what they do here. Such is a poet's love within their hurting heart for their hurting city, to tell its truth. Finally, I'll move us closer to home. I was first preparing this presentation over winter break, more specifically during the week of January 7th, when fires were ravaging my hometown of Los Angeles. So I felt compelled to do homage to my own city and to our wonderful region of Southern California. Jessica Salgado is a Salvadoran spoken word poet born and raised in LA. Of a person's relationship with their city, she said, quote, "A city will always change for you once you fall in love with it. In it, once you fall in love in the city. And then different parts of the city belong to you and that person that you were in love with." So I'll end with this beautiful poem to LA by the spoken word poet, as I said, Jessica Salgado. It's called Casamiento. It's from her collection Hermosa, which, as you may notice, has a jacaranda blossom on the cover. For many of us here in SoCal, we look forward to those fleeting weeks in spring when the jacarandas are in bloom. The video I'm going to play was made in collaboration with two local businesses just as rooted in the city as she is. Bella Doña LA, a clothing store that says it's rooted in sisterhood, motherhood, and neighborhood, and Sweet Street Cosmetics, a Chicana-founded and owned cosmetics line inspired by, quote, "our tias and the sweet streets of our city." Give me a second as I figure out how to...
Let's get married when the jacarandas are in bloom. When the lotus flowers on Echo Park Lake have stretched into open hands. Make me yours during summer, beneath the Dodgers Stadium fireworks, the night air my veil, the 101 taillights sequencing my gown, my bouquet, a palm tree borrowed from Sunset Boulevard. Let a procession of lowriders, Priuses, and rapid buses lead us to our reception. 100 street vendors with their hot dogs or elote carts lining the street, feeding those that celebrate our love. Let's have our first dance to a Snoop Dogg song while the neon lights from the liquor store shadow your beautiful face. someone setting free a dozen ducks taken from MacArthur Park. Let's make Pershing Square our dance floor. Borrow the mariachis from their plaza. Exposition Park the centerpiece to every table. Promise yourself to me on Slauson, on Cesar Chavez, on Temple, on Vermont, on Parkman. I have seen enough of the world to know that it has always been you. I return to you with open arms, my beautiful city, Los Angeles. I choose you in this life, in my parents' life, and in the lives they left to bring me to you.
In closing, I often tell my poetry students, some of whom are here today, that the more specific you are in your imagery, the more your reader will be able to relate their own experiences and memories to the poem. This is exactly what I experienced with Salgado's poem, which along with the fires helped reignite my love for my city. No pun intended. Salgado's Temple and Vermont streets became my Highland Avenue, where my best friends and I used fake IDs to get into the goth club Helter Skelter in the 90s. Growing up in LA, specifically in the neighborhoods of Culver City and Canoga Park, I couldn't wait to get out of there as soon as I could. I was tired of its traffic and pollution, burned out on its drugs and violence, and wary of its lack of public transportation. I've never wanted to move back there and still don't, but recently I've developed an appreciation for it. When I go back, I drive along its streets instead of on the freeways. I get to watch people walking by. Yes, believe it or not, people do walk in LA. I get to delight in the city's diversity and richness of culture and get to explore its many wonderful museums. It's the city where I made my first friends, first fell in love, first had my heart broken by a guy who did his hair and makeup like Robert Smith. And it's the city where I picked myself up again with the help of people who cared. It's where my mother almost lost her home several times to fires, but didn't. And despite its unfair reputation for being superficial, it's where hundreds of thousands came together last month to support one another. Turns out love is thicker than smoke. For we Los Angelinos remember and cherish that love just as much as, if not more than, we remember and dread the flames that destroyed so much. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you for being here. Is the sound okay? Sometimes it's too loud, I think, for me. Okay, so this is a very different kind of subject, but the premise of my talk, I think, suits well to this panel. And that premise is that poetry and literature can teach us as much about the city as sociology or history. Poetry and literature, of course, are creative fictions filled with moments and characters that never existed. But those fictions can capture something about urban life that other forms of representation can't, something real. Further still, literature can reveal to us things that are omitted or obscured by true sources of information about cities, such as official government records or their planned and built urban landscapes. Factual sources of information can, in fact, sometimes mislead us in our quest to understand the actual rhythms of human life and the meanings embedded in urban landscapes, right, with people who live there. This is especially true, I find, when you look at cities in the distant past, because we can usually only access them through ruins or whatever documents might survive or monuments, things like this. There's no people to interview, there's no flaneur to follow or anything like that. And when all the stuff of everyday life is lost or broken or scattered, there's a tendency, I find, to be kind of seduced by the monuments that survive, the kind of symbols of sort of state power. And those kind of flatten out our understanding, I think, of cities in the past. Like, for example, the Colosseum in Rome. It's like, that's all you need to know. There it is, you know, that's... So this talk is not going to be about Rome, obviously. Today, I'd like to try to demonstrate how literature can both complement and even correct, maybe, our understanding of historical cities by looking at Chang'an. That's modern Xi'an. And that's a city that was the capital of ancient and medieval China for centuries during the distant past. In today's talk, I'm going to focus on Chang'an during the Tang Dynasty. Oh, sweet. Okay, so a little bit of backstory. The Tang Dynasty you see here has been called one of China's greatest golden ages. This is a period that saw Chinese influence extend far west into what is now Central Asia. It was a time of incredible cosmopolitanism within China, which was facilitated by the Silk Road networks that stretched all the way, through the Middle East to the edge of the Mediterranean and terminated in the east at Chang'an, at Xi'an. It was also a time of real cultural efflorescence in things like the ceramic arts, but also especially in poetry and literature, which is why I chose this subject. Before the Tang, China had undergone a period of extended warlordism and sort of just general disruption, strong uncertainty, When imperial control was sort of reestablished in the early 7th century AD, as you see here, the Tang emperors wanted to turn the page on everything that they had just been through, the sort of turbulence of the recent past. And they also wanted to evoke the glories of a more distant, better past. For that reason, they chose to base their power at a place called Guanzhong, which is a region in the Wei River Valley where the capital had been located some 5 centuries earlier, way back in the distant Han Dynasty. Now, the Han Dynasty was China's great classical empire. This is their time that was contemporary with the Roman Empire in the West and kind of almost fulfilled a similar purpose in East Asia. The Han Dynasty had based their capital in exactly this place, and that capital had also been called Chang'an. That's indicated here, right? They kind of used this spot over and over for centuries. So that original city at this point was in ruins, ruined by war and by flooding of the Wei River. It was not suitable to be capital for a new kind of fresh, reunified China. So the new rulers at this time chose to build a brand new city, just southeast of the old ruins, from scratch. They kept the name Chang'an to link themselves to the kind of glories of antiquity, but they designed this new city to be something new and fresh, a kind of symbol of this ambitious new empire that had restored peace, basically, to China. And so Tang Chang'an, subject of this talk, is really impressive. It very quickly became one of the most, if not the most, populous and important cities in the world at its time, and held that position for about 3 centuries. As you can maybe get a sense of from this map, it's especially notable for its size and meticulous urban planning. One of the advantages of starting from scratch, We know a lot about it from archaeology and from surviving official historical documents, such as the New Book of Tang or the Gazette of Chang'an. There's a lot of documents describing the city. And we know, for example, that it was big, roughly 6 by 5 and change miles. So over 30 square miles only inside the walls. There are probably suburban areas as well. We know that it was precisely oriented to the cardinal directions in alignment with traditional principles of astrology and feng shui. We know that there was a sort of imperial city, the palace city. You see it there to the north, where the government was housed, official offices, magistrates, and also the palace and its extensive pleasure gardens. And we know that outside the imperial city, Chang'an itself was divided and divided into sort of a series of boxes. The city was cut by 9 longitudinal and 12 latitudinal thoroughfares, and these were big streets, enormous streets. For example, right here, right in between these 2 wards, which I'll talk about later, that avenue is 87 feet wide. So the archaeologists think that it could accommodate something like 20 carriages riding abreast at the same time. It's built for impressive scale. These streets, of course, they accommodated traffic, and they could be parade routes, and actually, we think fire breaks in case a disaster broke out, it could contain these things. They also had this kind of functional purpose of dividing the city into these smaller units. So in Chang'an, the population lived in over 100 of these residential wards. We know the names of a lot of them. You could get a sense of them from this map. These were typically roughly rectangular in shape, each of them big, sizable units, about 1 mile on the long side. So we're talking a lot larger than what we think of as a neighborhood now. Inside, a ward was bisected by cross streets and then further subdivided into area blocks and individual residential units. So it's almost like Russian dolls, those kind of nesting dolls, as the design of the city. Housing was ample, something California should, have more of. The city grew exponentially because they created a lot of space for people to use. And so within a century or so of its creation from scratch, the official histories tell us that it hits 1 million people by 750 CE, which is pretty impressive. That's way bigger than contemporary Baghdad or Constantinople, the other major cities at the time. Chang'an also abounded in walls and gates. So much so that contemporary poets, and there were a lot of poets who wrote about the city at the time, they often referred to the capital using the stock phrase, the place of ninefold walls. The exterior defensive circuit was 18 feet high, studded with towers designed to withstand a siege, of course, if it came to that. But internally, each ward had its own set of walls and gates. And those gates were locked at sundown because the city authorities imposed a nightly curfew on residents of the capital. No one was allowed to leave their wards after sundown, and they signaled this by banging drums around the city. You got to get inside. We know from Tang laws, which survived, Tang-era laws, that if you were caught outside your ward at night, there was a wide range of penalties, and they were not mild penalties. A year of penal servitude, branding, and if you are found around here lurking, strangulation. Yeah, I know, right? Talk about being grounded, right? So, this is just a quick glance here. I don't want to not get to literature, but you can hopefully get the sense that order and control were guiding principles of this city's urban design. Chang'an became this thriving hub of trade and culture. It was really famous for its exotic food and music, Central Asian influences and all this. A real center of Buddhist debate and theology and a big literary sort of hub. But it was also this very tightly controlled space with a lot of surveillance, or at least it seems that way to us. And if you'll indulge me for one moment more, if you zoom in on some of these residential wards, right, here's a kind of stylized schematic of what these things were like. Way bigger than modern city blocks, No block is a mile long, at least not in San Diego. They almost function like miniature towns within the city, sort of semi-sealed. Their walls were about 10 feet high. The gates here were always manned by guards and sort of low-level magistrates whose job was not only to make sure you're supposed to be there and you're in at night, but to report up any problems to the municipal authority, any potential problems to the municipal authorities. And unlike contemporary cities, say in medieval Europe, right, Chang'an had this very sort of logical layout. The sort of residential blocks would be broken down into their position vis-a-vis the streets and gates. So we think that it'd be easy to give directions. You would know how to navigate the city well because it's a grid. It's like Manhattan in this sense. It's logical. Very different from medieval Paris or something like that. The official histories also indicate that the government told some residents of the city where they were allowed to live. These wards were not all created equal. Some of them seem to have been very crowded and poor. Some of them seem to have been almost semi-rural on the periphery, given over to sort of urban agriculture. And some of them near the palace city were posh, really exclusive, reserved for nobles or rich merchants who did government contract work. Imagine such a thing, right? So if you try to enter such a place, that immediately is detected by the ward guards, and you're not getting in, put it that way, right? If you look at a similar diagram of the city's two great marketplaces, located on the western and eastern sides of Chang'an, you could see similar sort of regulation. These were also large walled spaces. Each marketplace was the size of several wards kind of combined. And we know a lot about them, as you could tell, from texts and sort of historical documents. We know that every marketplace contained multiple offices for officials who were there to regulate transactions. We know that there were watchtowers that are actually not showing up on this, but watchtowers posted at the intersections with guards to keep an eye on any potential rumblings of discontent. We know that the government stipulated which trades and goods could be placed in certain areas, so it's spatially regulated. And they seem to really be concerned, especially with marketplaces and things like this, which makes some sense if you think about it. I mean, this is where people would gather in large and somewhat hard to control crowds. This is where the most foreigners were found, because a lot of these people were merchants coming from somewhere else. And this is where the most movable wealth is. So if a riot is going to break out, it's going to break out here. And so the penalties for staying in the markets after dark, for example, were among the harshest in Tang law. So you kind of get the idea, right? If we look at our historical records and the spatial layout of this city, this time, this place, we see a very orderly, predictable place. And poetry, some poetry produced in the Tang period, has the same image. It conveys the same sense. So I'll show you just one brief example. There's not as much poetry in the history talk, but here's an example by a poet called Bai Juyi. He was a politician as well as a poet, which I think is interesting, and it's called Upon Ascending Guanyin Terrace Overlooking the City. In his view, the myriad houses resemble a chessboard. The dozen avenues like planted furrows. From far off, pinprick torchlights going to court can be discerned, a stringed constellation west of the 5 gates. Order, serene, control. And even the name of the city conveyed these sentiments. Chang'an means, in classical Chinese, perpetual peace. Right? So this is, if you want, the official image. No, okay. So then, how can literature add to or destabilize this impression that we might get from archaeology and sort of the official voice? Here we're very fortunate because, as I noted, the Tang dynasty was also China's first real literary golden age. Many works of poetry and prose produced in this dynasty went on to become like masterpieces of Chinese literature and became part of the canon and are still taught in school today. Chang'an was both the kind of center of a lot of this output, meaning writers living in the capital were doing the work, but it was also the subject of many of these works because they were in love with their cities, with their city. A prose subgenre developed in this time in China, which I guess you could call them stories of adventure and misadventure set in the big, crazy city, big cosmopolitan city. A lot of these tales from Tang Chang'an, they center on the experiences of young men who come there for school, who came to the capital to study and eventually attempt to pass the civil service examination, which was, some of you are no doubt familiar, an intensely grueling exam that could catapult you into security and social prestige, or if you failed, bring unending shame upon you and your family, right? So a lot of people came here because this was the social ladder, basically. And the characters are often these kind of men in these tales. A lot of these tales from Tang Chang'an have a kind of picaresque quality. Young man arrives, then things happen. People get lost, drunk, robbed, humiliated, worse. And they usually find their way back to the straight path and come to a happy ending, though not always. This literature is really useful because although the characters are fictional, the places and the exams and the world they're in is very real, or at least historically plausible. And so the stories can bring Chang'an to life, I think, in a way that official sources in archaeology can't really. And they can also call into question this narrative we get of perpetual peace and ordered control. And here I should say, too, a lot of, in this part of the talk, I'm really inspired by, borrowing from incredible work about this by a scholar called Linda Rui Feng, who's at the University of Toronto, who's done this incredible analysis of literature from Tang China. I don't read Chinese. Thank you, Linda, wherever you are. Let's bring her to campus. Okay, I only have time in what remains of this to talk about one such story in any detail, and it was a famous one, though. So this is a story called The Tale of Li Hua, and this is how it goes. The story begins when a promising young scholar named Zheng arrives in Chang'an, laden with his father's hopes and 2 years' worth of money to support himself while he's studying to take the test. He quickly falls, though, for Li Hua, a beautiful courtesan, and then he moves in with her. And you can probably see where this is going. He blows all his money paying for her time and affection. Then the money runs out, and Zheng is abandoned by Li Hua and her madam. He becomes sick and destitute, and then he eventually recovers by finding work at a funeral parlor singing dirges. You never know what life is going to bring you. Zheng, it turns out, is such a good singer that he eventually wins a citywide singing contest, kind of bringing him some notoriety. But this draws the attention of his father, who is horrified by his son's disgraceful career, beats him nearly to death, and leaves him abandoned on the streets of the capital city, essentially to die. And then you could probably guess what's going to happen. There, lying on the streets, Li Hua finds him, nurses him back to health, helps him get his act together. He studies for the test. He passes the test. And then he begins his glorious career with her as his faithful wife. Right? So, any students out there, you can always turn it around. You can always turn it around. Now, obviously, there's a lot you could say about this story. It's obviously this moralistic fable and a bit of a warning to young men. But the important thing for this talk is the vision that it presents of the capital. In the tale of Li Hua, Chang'an doesn't seem particularly orderly or particularly peaceful. Our hero, Zheng, is hopelessly out of his league, not just because he's outmatched by Li Hua, the courtesan, but because the city itself kind of confounds him. And I'll show you some examples of what I mean here. So the first part of the story, the first half really, takes place in this area circled in red. Zheng, at the beginning, he goes to the Eastern Market, which we know to buy stuff. And we know that the Eastern Market had several print shops that sold texts, basically. It's very plausible that a student would go to this place, you know. He leaves the market intending to visit a friend here in Perin-Coombs ward in the sort of southwest quadrant. He enters the ward by the east gate, and then he gets lost, interestingly. He finds himself kind of wandering down an alley, and there's just a few things he doesn't seem to understand. One thing is that in practice, at the ward level, the grid system broke down. As people occupied that space for generations and, you know, renovated their houses and acquired property and all this, they started making their own changes. They carved alleyways through things. And in fact, one of the classical Chinese words to describe these roads means swerving, right? All this is a reminder, just Citeaux points this out, that, you know, people will do what they want. Urban planning be damned in practice, right? So Zheng first glimpses Li Hua when he's kind of wandering in this alley a little bit lost, and he looks through an open door into a courtyard, and he sees through the house, quote, a woman standing whose bewitching looks were exquisite beyond any compare. And it's like, oh my God. And the other thing he doesn't realize is that Perin-Coombs ward here was one of Chang'an's pleasure districts. There weren't really signs announcing this, but it was in practice, famous for courtesans. So he thinks he's just seen a beautiful woman in a not very fancy house, and it's his luckiest day. But actually, of course, she immediately recognizes a mark, and she skillfully kind of draws him into her world. And he becomes bogged down, if you want, in this part of the city. Later in the story, when the money runs out, the members of Li Hua's household, they use this complex series of maneuvers to give Zheng the slip, because he's not really useful anymore. The madam suggests that Li Hua and Zheng travel to like a distant mountain temple to pray for an heir, for a son. And then while they're away, a messenger suddenly arrives saying to Li Hua, you have to rush home right now. The madam is sick. She needs you immediately. The messenger also says to Zheng, you need to go to Li Hua's aunt's house because she was supposed to go there and she's elderly. You have to care for her. So they split up, right? Li Hua goes to the brothel. Zheng goes to the aunt's house. Then Zheng goes back to the brothel to find her. And can we guess what happened? The house is empty. Of course. Then he wanders around. The next day he goes back to the aunt's house here in Zhuangyang ward. So they're kind of shuffling around here. And when he gets to the aunt's house the day following, it's been rented to new tenants. And they say, oh, no, don't know where she went. If it all seems a little confusing, I think that's the point of the story. Zheng looks at Li Hua and he looks at Chang'an and he sees stable predictability, when in actuality the city's residents can kind of move him around like a shell game because he's kind of a rube here. Li Hua's household is able to disappear overnight in the story, but wasn't there supposed to be a curfew that you're not allowed to move around at night? So did they bribe the local magistrates? It's not stated, but something's going on here. And the aunt's house, which in the story down here is described as very grand and solid, he thinks she's this woman with great money, it transforms like that into this rental with a bunch of random people in there. So the city comes across not as stable and peaceful, but as kind of ephemeral in the story. Both of these moves could also happen, Li Hua's household disappearing and the aunt's, aunt moving out. Both of those moves could only happen because everybody is behind a wall in this city. The wards have their own walls, individual houses have their own walled courtyards, which means Li Hua and her aunt could kind of pack up and move without anybody really getting wind of it too quickly. And that's a reminder, of course, that walls can hide crimes just as well as prevent them. And here I'll just briefly, as I come to the end of my talk, let you know about a couple other stories set in Chang'an that pick up this theme of walls hiding dirty secrets. So there's a tale included in a collection called Tales from the Northern Ward, in which a woman murders her maid because she thinks the maid is sleeping with her lover, and then she buries the maid's body in the backyard. It's very like Forensic Files, There's another story in which a young man is lured into joining a gang of acrobatic thieves. They could kind of like parkour up walls with special boots. And then, this is an intentional pun, he becomes the fall guy for that gang and goes to prison because he's not as good as them at doing it. But then later, they rescue him from the jail through a hole in the roof. Actually, the appendix to this collection of stories, The Tales of the Northern Ward, actually includes a rider, a statement that tells the reader that visitors to the capital should be aware that there are violent criminal networks operating in some of the wards who act with impunity beyond the reach of law enforcement. So the literature reveals for us something different, Returning briefly to the tale of Li Hua as I wrap up, there's beats in that story alone that show Chang'an in a different light. I already mentioned the main character has two falls from grace. He's abandoned, and he's kind of wandering around sick and poor, and then his father beats him, and he becomes, like near death on the streets. At those times, when he's on the streets, Chang'an seems like a pretty cruel place with a pretty high tolerance for public violence. Also, I thought you're not allowed to sleep on the streets at night, but there he is in the story. I don't think any of this should surprise us. Scenes like these are examples of how the realness in literature can sometimes capture truths that official histories or sanitized, poems and praise omit. I'm out of time, so I'll just wrap by saying what I'm trying to demonstrate in this talk is that history and literature really need each other, or we're better together, something like that. Literature has to be historicized, I think, to be fully understood, especially old literature. And history really needs to embrace the truth within fiction if it wants to capture a fuller range of human experience. Yeah. So the city, thank you. The city, I think, is the perfect subject for this because there's so much layered life and creativity in the city. Chang'an's one example, but any city could do for this. And I think no single discipline can capture this kind of complexity that these landscapes have to offer. Not natural landscapes at all, really. Landscapes that are for us, but maybe natural to us. Anyway, I think that's enough. So thank you for your attention.
My only slide. This will be a view of cities from someone who has only lived on their edges as an observer. And I'm giving you a short bibliography of works that seep their way into this, but the only one I will actually refer to is Calvino. The doubleness of cities. The first city I actually lived in was Seattle, but I didn't live in the city. What does it mean to live in the city? Within the city limits? Downtown? Wherever the traffic is heavy? I lived right next to a campus some 5 miles from downtown. So are you in the city when you're downtown? Can you live there? In the 6 years I lived in Seattle as a graduate student, I must have gone downtown about twice a year, mainly to hear jazz at the Penthouse, which wasn't a penthouse. In the 60s, the tallest building downtown was Smith Tower, but now you can't see or even find it among the high-rise obelisks of the modern city. So its designation as a tower now indicates an absence, a simulation. Like the penthouse, a clear example that the signs of modernity point to an absence. An example being a sign that reads gourmet restaurant, which indicates for everyone that it is not one. Or a suburban project in a floodplain. I was thinking of Menifee. Without trees or creeks, but with streets named after them, like Willow Creek Lane. What the high-rise buildings indicate is the centrality of power, which becomes more and more important as the city spreads out and there's more activity to authorize and organize and police. The closest I ever got to an experience of Seattle as a city was to show up in 1968 at the City Hall Plaza, which was not a plaza, but a simple paved square with a few scrawny trees to indicate what hadn't been there for a long time, a forest of pine trees. I was there to protest the gagging of Bobby Seale during the trial of the Chicago Seven. I stood near the back of a crowd that got tired of chanting "Free Bobby" and began throwing rocks and fruit at the City Hall, perhaps thinking Bobby was somehow inside, one of the Seattle Seven. Suddenly behind us, emerging from underground passages, possibly sewers that weren't really sewers, were phalanxes of policemen with no ID numbers on their uniforms, indicating they weren't policemen. We all ran in several directions. The non-cops, having accomplished a dispersal of the crowd, except for the ones they clubbed, didn't pursue us further. I found myself and a few other protesters walking down a side street, which actually seemed like a downtown living space. It was curved and lined with attached three-story buildings and shops, now closed, it must have been a Sunday, displaying goods no student could afford. All I was thinking about was how in the world I was going to find my parked car. But in retrospect, the street was an empty version of the city streets that we see on our cell phone doom scroll, advertising, for example, best cities to visit in Kosovo. The street was curved and human-scaled, and you could imagine crowds of tourists buying tchotchkes and eating expensive food with unpronounceable names under umbrellas. All the street lacked were cobblestones. You could imagine bumping into Stanley Tucci. You could imagine it as cosmopolitan, only for tourists. Let the city wait on your needs until you can't tell if you're in Verona or Oslo. Is the modern city defined by its attractions? Have these attractions become so global you can't tell what city you're in? Looking for some Istrum Yogta, you can find it in Manchester. This is what remains of the cosmopolitan markets of the old Silk Road cities, tourists from all over. Anyway, I found my way back to my car and drove to where I lived and studied, outside the central administration of power. Or was it? Italo Calvino writes in Invisible Cities that we take delight not in a city's wonders, but in the answer it gives to a question of ours. Making my way through the spasms of the 60s, I wondered if a campus was only an estate, lulled by lectures and lawnmowers, and its answer was the presence of men in pressed suits taking photographs of Vietnam protesters waving signs out of windows, having just taken over the freshman English class I had been teaching. I watched them from a lawn, clutching my roll sheet and lesson plans, next to someone who seemed like a newsman with a heavy camera, which was suddenly wrested from his hands by a student and smashed. I looked up, and in the high windows of neighboring halls, men in suits were safely taking photographs from behind windows. What had been absent from campus was now present. The city was taking names, saying, "Why do you think your posh campus had nothing to do with the city you named when people asked you where you lived?" Growing up in a beach town just beyond the limits of the vast sprawl of Los Angeles, I understood the city not as a place, but as a warning. I never got to the actual place. You didn't drive downtown because, as Gertrude Stein said about Oakland, there was no there. I understand Oakland for years now has had an actual mall in it that is called There. Good for Gertrude Stein. Downtown was a city hall, demure, but the tallest building around, poking up as you passed by on the freeway. I had no experience of LA except on rare visits to my father's office off Olympic Boulevard, or to the big Art Deco May Company on Wilshire, where my mom shopped once a year, or to big movie premieres in Hollywood. At the Egyptian Theater, for example, which was not Egyptian. We knew the city by its smog, which seized you like an angina inside your car. You had to take little sips of air. This happened by the time you reached Beverly Hills driving east. This was how LA announced its urbanity. Where was downtown? Where is it now? If it is marked by obelisks, it's at the bottom of Bunker Hill. Even Siri has trouble getting you to Bunker Hill, nestled as it is inside a chaos of overlapping freeways. Siri says, in her mildly insistent voice, "Take the next exit, then turn right at the first light and maneuver suddenly and wildly into the middle lane of the 3 lanes to the left. If you don't, I cannot return you for another try, and you will find yourself in Azusa." But if you can navigate, you will be dropped steeply into a conclave of very high-rise rectangles sheathed in dark brown or charcoal gray glass. They have no signs, except on their recessive glass doors, signs whispering something like National Affiliated Strategies. Most have no signs at all, and so absence is everywhere. The high-rise obelisks might be offices or condos or both. You cannot tell because the towers are designed to hide windows. There's hardly anybody in the streets. Those that live and work in the towers have parked their cars in subterranean garages and taken elevators up to where they can look out their hidden windows at other hidden windows. The towers are numerous enough to create their own weather. You have to concentrate to even see them. The only reason to be in this district is to celebrate the past, the Baroque glamour of the old Biltmore Hotel, preserved at the bottom of one of the towers, and the grand museums and concert halls and theaters at the top of the hill. Their audiences, like the denizens, park their cars underground and ride up in elevators. The present is absent, having been sucked out of the world to make way for a future of uncontrolled markets and huge investment potential. Many years later, my wife and I honeymooned in Midtown Manhattan. We splurged on the Sherry Netherland Hotel, which was being renovated for leakage, its lobby a construction site, and no discounts on the price of rooms. From the 11th floor, we heard all night the shrill sounds of emergency. It's not great for a honeymoon. In the daytime streets, no one looked at anyone else. Perhaps a shared glance would be considered a violation of agreements that made the city operational. While there were elegant restaurants, a fine Broadway revue about the blues, and the walking paths of Central Park, we wound up relying on an open food truck across the street with good takeout and cheap coffee. a relic, perhaps, from the earlier days of the Murray Hill neighborhood, when old buildings weren't landmarks and Little Armenia thrived, the days of ethnic markets and street food. Who knows? That food truck may soon be, or already has been, sprayed in silver paint and exhibited in a museum of contemporary art in the village, a direct sign of an absence. The presence of absence, such a doubleness, a duplicity if you distrust it, is Italo Calvino's theme in Invisible Cities. Wealth and glamour are inextricable from poverty and misery. All the dreamlike cities that Marco Polo imagines in order to entertain Kubla Khan are two-faced. Each aspect of them has an obverse, quote, like a sheet of paper with a figure on either side, which can neither be separated nor look at each other. As one page is seen, the other is hidden. Like the view of downtown San Diego from a window of the plush U.S. Grant Hotel with its high teas in the lobby to the ruin of the Horton Plaza Mall, and vice versa. The two do not meet, but they are connected. The downtowns of American cities in the late 19th century were overcrowded slums for immigrants building canals and subways, ramshackle apartments below which cosmopolitan communities sprouted, like those of Old Paris, which were destroyed and covered over by boulevards broad enough to allow military vehicles to suppress any uprisings over housing conditions and the price of eggs. I'm not making that one up for a recent, that was actually true. The Champs-Élysées, for example, on either side of it is a kind of Beverly Hills of high-end shops and overpriced bistros. The more a downtown is built up, the more it destroys, and then celebrates what it destroys, calling it all Elysian Field. Just so, the Irish mythologized the fairies, who were the conquered people driven underground or buried there. Early Hawaiians celebrated the Menehune, whom they had annihilated. These mythologies were built up over ashes and absence. Consider the Heard Museum in Phoenix, a celebration of Indian art founded and funded by a development of the state and its capital city, a development that displaced the indigenous people from their lands and their burial grounds, one of which is directly below the museum, which celebrates them to the point of mythologizing them, as if in a kind of senseless expiation. Their art is on display in a self-described, quote, world-class museum shop. The most and the best time I ever spent near the heart of a big city was 30 weeks spread over 5 summers in Guadalajara, Mexico. Though presiding over a vast landscape of suburbs and slums, it has a major street that on Saturdays is cleared of cars to make way for bicycles and walkers, a variation of the more ambitious and permanent Greenway in Minneapolis. If memory serves me, the tallest buildings were churches. This is back in the aughts. I loved the lack of Greco-Roman beauty in the big statue of Minerva in the middle of a traffic circle. She has indigenous features, which makes her more present than absent. Scattered around this center of the city are beautifully tiled late 19th century houses that the dictator Porfirio Diaz ordered built in the French manner as homes for his courtiers or oligarchs. Several of them are now restaurants, and my wife and I ate at one of them a few times, perched on a big street corner lawn. The food was more Spanish than Mexican. Contemporary orchestral music pulsed as though from a disco, and on the sidewalks stood men at attention, facing the streets, holding machine guns. In the homey but colonial metropolis of good food, the city asserts itself as a presence that contains but does not speak of the past. The statue of Minerva, miles away, holds a spear and a shield, appropriate to the goddess of warfare. Since I have been there, Guadalajara has built high-rise hotels. What do we want from our cities? Their dreams and realities, their cosmopolitanism and their tourism, their energy and decay, their ruins and their modernity, their riches and their poverty, their presence and absence, their grandeur in any case, all intimately connected, but facing in different directions. Whether we live in or visit them, are we always on one side, either fearing or hoping for the other? Thank you.